Good evening. I'm Teresa Skubik, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, March 19th. Last night in an interview on Fox News, U.S. President Donald Trump was asked about his relationship with Canada and implied that he prefers working with the Liberals and that Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is no friend of his.
Much more. We have much more.
I don't think so.
Just so you understand, we subsidize Canada, and I like Canada. I love Canada. I love Wayne
now
Gretzky.
The Liberal guy,
I love his wife.
The Liberal Party is going to win now in the next election, most likely. And they were down and out. Isn't that going to make them more hostile to us and possibly
no, I'd rather deal with a Liberal than a
for
Conservative.
China, closer to Canada, and that would really put us in a bind.
The Conservative that's running is stupidly no friend of mine. I don't know him, but he said negative things. So when he says negative things, I couldn't care less. I think it's easier to deal, actually, with a Liberal. And maybe they're going to win, but I don't really care. It doesn't matter to me at all.
So your end game is what with them?
My end game is I don't want to have a big deficit. I don't want to see the United States of America, and you say 60 and I say 200, but it doesn't matter. I don't want us to pay 60 or $200 billion to a country that if they were a state, think of this, it would be our biggest, most beautiful, it would be great.
Mr. Trump was also questioned on why he's been harder on Canada than U.S. adversaries, and he called Canada one of the nastiest countries to deal with.
With Canada than you are with some of our biggest adversaries.
Only because it's meant to be our 51st state. And
okay, but
but listen to this for a second.
We need their territory. They have territorial advantage. We're not going to let them get close to China.
Look,
right?
I deal with every country, indirectly or directly. One of the nastiest countries to deal with is Canada. The people that, now this was Trudeau, the people that good old Justin, I call him Governor Trudeau, his people were nasty. And they weren't telling the truth. They never told the truth. You know that, they'd say, well, we don't charge. Well, they do. They charge tremendous. They charge tremendous.
And this morning, in Sudbury, Ontario, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre responded directly to President Trump's comments.
Yesterday, the president said that having a Liberal prime minister would be easier for him to deal with, just as he threatened once again to make us the 51st state. And you know what? On that point, it's true. I'm a strong leader. I'm a tough guy to deal with. I'm firm in my convictions, and I'll always put Canada first. By contrast, in 10 years, the Liberals have blocked resource projects, hiked taxes, and driven $500 billion of investment to the U.S., all while Mark Carney moved his corporate headquarters out of Canada to New York, bringing jobs to the United States of America. Mark Carney will back down, and his Liberal policies will keep Canada weak, just like Trump wants. Giving the Liberals a fourth term will only weaken our country and strengthen Donald Trump. We need a strong, tough leader who will unleash our resources, cut taxes and red tape, build homes, and make our economy less reliant on the Americans to put Canada first.
Conservative strategist and former spokesperson to Pierre Poilievre, Anthony Kosh, joined us to discuss how Mr. Trump's comments could shake up the upcoming federal election.
Well, here's the thing. I think in some respect, it's still a little bit too early to tell. But one thing's for sure, the Liberal narrative that Pierre Poilievre is Donald Trump's man in Canada has just gone up in flames, right? I mean, he said it in as clear words as you could possibly say. One, he said, I'd rather work with a Liberal than a Conservative. And then second of all, he said, Pierre Poilievre, actually, he doesn't even name Pierre Poilievre, he says the conservative guy, or like vaguely makes a passing reference to him, is what I think he said very stupidly, not a fan of mine. So I don't care. So I think if the Liberals were really planning on honing in on a campaign as painting Pierre Poilievre as being the MAGA lieutenant or lieutenant in good Canadian parlance in Canada, that's no longer going to be a viable option for them.
We also asked Anthony if Mr. Trump's comments will help Mr. Poilievre in the campaign.
I think it does. I think many people are going to. I think it definitely muddies the waters, but it has been fascinating to see the response of some Liberals online and otherwise to this, cocking up all sorts of conspiracy theories, talking about how this is one big psyop of reverse psychology. But I think, once again, people massively overestimate the ideological commitments of the president. thinking that he particularly cares about, whether it's a conservative or a liberal in Canada or anywhere, quite frankly. I think he sees that hopefully future Prime Minister Pierre Poilievre is taking a very hard line vis-a-vis American tariffs and doesn't like what he's hearing. And I don't think he really cares about what the domestic policy outlook of Mr. Carney or of Mr. Poilievre really amounts to. I think that's really what it comes down to. Who says the nicest things about me most recently? And that's the basis for his decision. So we'll see. But in the meantime, I think that line of argumentation has been neutralized.
A Vermont senator says there's no place for U.S. President Donald Trump's 51st state comments. Democratic Senator Peter Welsh adds that he's horrified by tariffs on Canadian goods and their destructive potential for both Americans and Canadians. He made the comments at a business roundtable where he was joined by Quebec Liberal MP Mary Cloud Bibeau. This morning, Senator Welsh was on CNBC and repeated his remarks that he sees tariffs as nothing but a downside.
I see the tariffs as nothing but downside. At our tariff roundtable, where we had Canadian businesses in Vermont businesses, they talked about how this totally disrupts their supply chains, how the back and forth is going to hurt the manufacturing, the ag relationships, things that have been built up over years. Vermont's going to get hit hard because we get a lot of our electricity, a lot of our home heating fuel, a lot of our gasoline. We could see prices go up on a gallon of gas about 40 cents. So it's hard to see how the Canadian tariffs are anything good for the country, particularly when the president is linking those essentially to the 51st state talk, which is incredibly insulting and eroding the kind of trusted relationship we've had with Canada for decades.
Ontario's premier says he's keeping the possibility of reintroducing a surcharge on electricity exported to the United States in his back pocket, as Canada awaits new proposed tariffs from the U.S. Doug Ford says Canada's goal is to be first in line for exemptions when Donald Trump's administration drops new levies on worldwide imports on April 2nd.
And I can tell you what they want. They're going to put a global tariff on the whole world on August the 2nd. What we're working at is making sure that we're first in line for exemptions. And we told the administration very clearly how we feel these tariffs are going to hurt the American people. Yes, it's going to hurt Canada, but it's going to hurt the American people. Mark my words, on April the 2nd, markets will continue to tumble. They were down over $4 trillion. Consumer confidence is down right now. Investments are down. Inflation is happening. And plants, if they continue, assembly plants in the U.S. will close down. People will be out of work. And I can tell you, our closest allies right now are the American people. And so we're going to continue the conversations. We look forward to continuing these talks. And we aren't looking forward to April the 2nd. But we will retaliate, dollar for dollar, tariff for tariff. It is going to hurt the Americans. It is going to hurt us, but we can't roll over. We have to make sure we stay strong, we stay united as a country, and we have to continue on fighting. And like I've said many times, I'll fight like I've never fought before for Ontario and Canada as a whole. We have a great team of premiers, and we're going to continue staying focused.
Mr. Ford revealed some details about a meeting he had last week with U.S. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick, calling it productive. The meeting was arranged after Ontario put a 25% electricity surcharge on exports to 3 states before Ford withdrew to not antagonize American officials further. And Prime Minister Mark Carney hopes that the families of 2 First Nations women murdered by a serial killer have closure after the remains were recovered from a Winnipeg area landfill. Mr. Carney acknowledged the gruesome discovery during his visit to Nunavut and paid tribute to the women's families who fought to bring them home.
I just think it's important to acknowledge the findings from the Prairies Green landfill in Winnipeg and express to the families of Mercedes, Myron, and Morgan Harris, and to everyone who loved these women, recognition of just how horrific it is to relive this tragedy over and over again. And I hope that this unfortunate events today begin to provide some of that closure.
Manitoba RCMP have confirmed 2 sets of remains discovered at the Prairie Green landfill in the past month belonging to Morgan Harris and Mercedes Myron. A search of the landfill began in December for the 2 women who were killed in 2022 by serial killer Jeremy Skibicki. Prime Minister Mark Carney has revealed a plan to strengthen Arctic security by bolstering Canadian Armed Forces presence and over-the-horizon radar tech to monitor threats. During a stop on Tuesday in Nunavut, Mr. Carney said that Ottawa will spend $420 million to build on previous commitments to enhance airspace monitoring from the Canada-U.S. border to the Arctic.
We're committing nearly $420 million to protect that sovereignty with forces across land, air, and sea, with greater sustained and year-round presence here in the Arctic. The world is changing. Our adversaries are increasingly emboldened. International institutions and norms that have kept Canada secure are now being called into question. And the United States priorities, our ally, our United States priorities, once closely aligned with our own, are beginning to shift. Our government recognizes that while Canada must be strong in our partnerships, particularly NORAD, and today's announcements will strengthen our commitment to NORAD, well, that is true. We cannot and should not look first to others to defend our nation.
The Prime Minister is also pledging $253 million in new funding for Indigenous reconciliation initiatives in the North.
Canada is strong when we build constructive nation-to-nation partnerships. And it's strong when we work with Inuit, Métis, and First Nations communities across the North and across the country. And that's why Canada's new government is taking action to protect the North, affirm our sovereignty, but to also develop our potential by investing over $250 million in reliable electricity and new affordable housing. This includes building and repairing over 570 homes, ensuring communities have access to safe and dependable power today, building renewable energy security for tomorrow, and in the process, creating more good, high-paying jobs across Nunavut.
Canada's new Prime Minister is holding his debut First Ministers meeting at the end of the week. Mark Carney will mark his first full week since being sworn in by hosting a meeting with Canada's premiers on Friday. His office says that Mr. Carney's top priorities will include defending Canadians in the face of unjustified trade actions by the U.S. and strengthening the economy. His lead press secretary says that the meeting will be a chance for the Prime Minister and the premiers to discuss the work ahead and how they'll work collaboratively to create one Canadian economy. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is talking about goals for the Ring of Fire he would set if he wins a federal election. Mr. Poilievre says he would set a goal to greenlight all federal permits for the major critical mineral deposit north of Thunder Bay, Ontario, within 6 months of being elected.
The Liberals did everything they could to block this project. They have a keep-it-in-the-ground ideology. They have an anti-resource development policy in C-69. They've been sitting on the permits for 5 years. So we have more bureaucrats busy doing paperwork instead of miners digging for minerals. So, after a decade of Liberal keep-it-in-the-ground ideology, the Ring of Fire is on the brink of collapse, not to mention that Bill C-69, the Liberal no new pipelines and resource law, is still in place, making it impossible to get anything approved. That's why I'm announcing today that my government will set a deadline of 6 months to green light permits for the Ring of Fire. We will unleash the production of chromite, cobalt, copper, nickel, platinum, and others. We will also commit $1 billion over 3 years to help the Ontario government build the highway to get there.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford promised to speed up provincial approvals during the recent provincial election. While an early federal election has not yet been called, it is expected to happen soon. The Conservative Party is breaking from tradition and not allowing media on board its campaign planes and buses. The national campaign director blames considerable increases in travel costs. Traditionally, campaigns for the main federal political parties have provided seats on leaders' tours, with media organizations paying the travel costs. The campaign director says steps have been taken to ensure that Canadian media will be able to ask questions remotely and in person. On Tuesday, Minister of Jobs and Families Stephen McKinnon announced a federal investment of $67 million for 10 projects, which will train over 29,000 tradespeople in green skills as industries shift to low-carbon alternatives.
We have a big task in front of us. We're going to be building in this country. We're going to be building energy infrastructure. We're going to be building roads and bridges. We're going to be building public transit. We are going to be building port facilities, expanding our railroads, creating that trade-enabling infrastructure that underpins a strong economy. And you know what? We're going to be doing it with unionized, skilled tradespeople from coast to coast to coast.
While speaking to the press at Smart Location 47 in Ottawa, Mr. McKinnon says that Canada is taking steps to insulate the country's workers from outside threats and to develop the strongest pound-for-pound workforce in the world, with or without the help of the U.S.
You know what? We're going to choose to build with or without our friends down south. How we do that is supporting Made in Canada solutions, taking steps that add more, not less talent to our workforce, building resilience into everything we do, and yes, putting this crisis in the service of lasting, uniquely Canadian change. And we do that by giving Canadian workers, young and old, everything they need to get building, for the jobs today and the ones to come. Yes, we need to continue to develop our conventional energy sources, but we also, Canada must be at the forefront of renewable technologies, renewable energy technologies. And our deal with union brothers and sisters was you get to be a part of that too. Whether your job is displaced because of it, we obviously want to minimize that and are going to minimize that, or whether you want to create an opportunity for yourself in this new economy, we're going to be there to help you get the skills. CBTU and all of its affiliates were part of making that pact. Bill C-50, the Sustainable Jobs Act, was passed in Parliament with the help of unions across this country. And today, we're delivering on that promise, Sean, and I'm really, really proud that we're here today to do it.
Canada's annual rate of inflation jumped significantly in February to 2.6%, surprising a few economists who didn't think it would spike so much. February's figures are well ahead of the consensus among economists polled by Reuters, which called for 2.2% inflation in the month. Concordia University's Dr. Moshe Lander joined us for his reaction to the figures.
I don't know that it was unexpected. When you withdraw a tax holiday, inflation is going to go up. That's just kind of the way things go. I think that maybe it was a little bit lower than expected in December and January. It was a little bit higher than expected, let's say, in February. And if you average them out over the 3 months, it pretty much came in around a little bit above 2%, which is the midpoint of the Bank of Canada's target range. So I think this is just the consequences of a tax holiday removal. It can't be due to tariffs. Tariffs aren't in place in February, and they really didn't start until March. And even with people trying to alter their economic activity in February in anticipation, that's not really going to lead to inflation up towards the 2.6 number that we saw. So I think that this is just kind of the randomness that happens on month-to-month bases. And that's why the Bank of Canada says that their target range is between 1 and 3, as opposed to a target of 2.0. It gives that room for random variability to happen.
We also asked Dr. Lander about what impact tariffs will have on this upward inflationary trend.
So I'm going to use the Bank of Canada as the guidelines for what the effect is going to be. They met last week and they cut interest rates. So nobody has a clear picture as to what's going on because it's impossible to tell in real time what's happening. But if the Bank of Canada meets every 6 or 7 weeks and their next meeting isn't until the end of April, they could have decided to hold on to an interest rate cut if they felt that the tariff talk was going to generate above required inflation. The fact that they cut interest rates must mean that whatever data it is that they're seeing and however it is that their models are forecasting, they don't see inflation being an issue for at least the next 6 to 7 weeks. Otherwise, they would have just postponed an interest rate cut and said, we'll get back to you in April when we have one more month's worth of GDP, unemployment, and inflation data to see if our model is playing out the way we think. That doesn't mean that it's going to come in at 2.0. It could still come in at 2.6 or 2.8 or 2.9, but it's not a worrying enough trend that they would be pausing interest rates. Remember, the solution to rising inflation is increasing interest rates. So the fact that they didn't pause, let alone increase, must mean that there's nothing there that's substantive enough at this point to cause them to worry.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that the renewed airstrikes in Gaza are only the beginning and that they represent a necessary condition for freeing hostages.
Hamas is responsible for this war. It invaded our towns, murdered our people, raped our women, and kidnapped our loved ones. Hamas refused offer after offer to release our hostages. In the past 2 weeks, Israel did not initiate any military action in the hope that Hamas would change course. Well, that didn't happen. While Israel accepted the offer of President Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, Hamas flatly refused to do so. And this is why I authorized yesterday the renewal of military action against Hamas. Israel does not target Palestinian civilians. We target Hamas terrorists. And when these terrorists embed themselves in civilian areas, when they use civilians as human shields, they're the ones who are responsible for all unintended casualties. Palestinian civilians should avoid any contact with Hamas terrorists. And I call on the people of Gaza, get out of harm's way, move to safer areas. Because every civilian casualty is a tragedy. And every civilian casualty is the fault of Hamas. I thank President Trump for his unwavering support for Israel. Our alliance with the United States has never been stronger. To those who criticize Israel, I ask, what would you do if terrorists murdered and kidnapped your children? You would do what we are doing. In the face of pure evil, free societies have no choice but to fight. So I want to assure all our friends around the world, Israel will fight and Israel will win. We will bring our people home and we will destroy Hamas. We will not relent until we achieve all these vital goals. And we will not rest until we give our country a future of peace, prosperity, and hope.
The latest attack shattered a 2-month ceasefire, and the territory's health ministry says they killed more than 400 Palestinians, mostly women and children. A senior Hamas official said that Israel's decision to return to war amounts to a death sentence for the remaining hostages. And Donald Trump describes his call with Russian President Vladimir Putin as a major step toward his goal of ending the war in Ukraine. The White House says Russia agreed to an immediate pause in all strikes on energy and infrastructure targets. But Mr. Putin stopped short of backing the broader 30-day ceasefire that Mr. Trump is pushing for. Russia also demands that Ukraine pull back its troops from the 4 regions Moscow annexed, cancel its plans to join NATO, and sharply cut its army. Former Foreign Affairs Minister Lloyd Axworthy says Canada should convince Poland and the Baltic states to stay in a treaty banning landmines. Mr. Axworthy helped the Ottawa Convention become a reality in 1999. But defense ministers in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia now say that they unanimously recommend withdrawing from the treaty. Mr. Axworthy says pulling out of the anti-landmine treaty would make the world less safe. Our news director, David Clement, has more on the push for some countries to abandon that treaty.
Thank you for that, Teresa. On the issue of landmines, it's important first to go back in time and discuss how the mine ban treaty came about. So the whole purpose of creating a treaty to discourage the use of landmines was specifically to address the humanitarian problems that would come after landmines were used in war. And so it's important to remember here that landmines are indiscriminate. Once they're placed in the ground, if something sets it off, that is what sets it off. There is no way to discern what is ultimately going to end up being impacted by the explosion. And so what we saw throughout kind of the history of their use in modern warfare was after wars in particular, landmines that were laid down would end up exploding after conflict and end up exploding in many instances because civilians didn't know that they were there, impacting farmers, children, you name it. And so it created a very, very problematic circumstance where landmines were used. And then after a war had taken place, they remained in the ground and caused a lot of problems for civilian populations. And so the landmine treaty, it went through a bunch of different processes historically over time. It was adopted in 1997 in Oslo. It was signed in Ottawa in 1997 and was enforced on March 1st, 1999. And so it was created or spearheaded in large part by Canada's Foreign Minister, Lloyd Axworthy. And the whole purpose, as I said, was to try and address that growing problem of landmines. Now, what makes this interesting in the context of the Baltic states and why they are seeking to remove themselves from the treaty is mostly geography. So it's mostly geography in the sense of whom these countries border. So if we move, looking at the Baltic Sea, if you start with Estonia, they share a particularly large border with Russia. And so naturally, Estonia and the Estonians would be concerned that potentially there could be some sort of future Russian invasion. How do they defend themselves against a Russian invasion? Well, landmines would be an option there because it allows for them to fortify the border in a way that makes it incredibly difficult for future Russian forces to cross the border into Estonia. The same can be said for Latvia. They share a border with Russia and with Belarus. And so Belarus obviously is not Russia. They've long been an ally of Russia and Putin. Russian forces have moved through Belarus during the war in Ukraine. And so it has been a throughway for Russian forces. So obviously for the Latvians, there would be growing concern there as well. Now, if we keep moving south on a map, you look at Lithuania. Lithuania doesn't share a border with what we traditionally understand as Russia. They share a fairly large border with Belarus, so the same concerns that the Latvians would have. But what they do share is a border with Kaliningrad, which is a small part of Russia directly on the Baltic Sea, which is completely blocked off by the borders of Poland and Lithuania. And so, hypothetically speaking, the concerns of the Lithuanians, beyond being Belarus being a through point for Russian forces, it would be Russian forces entering Lithuania via Kaliningrad. And that is also the same for Poland. So Poland shares that same border with Belarus, and then to their north, they share a border with Kaliningrad. And so the move here from these Baltic states to remove themselves from the mine ban treaty is essentially an effort to create fortifications on where they could potentially see weak points with weak points with regards to a future conflict with Russian forces. And the reason why, despite the fact that obviously they are indiscriminate, the reason why some of these countries may be looking at using landmines is that landmines operate and exist without personnel. And so you don't have to have the border actively armed with thousands and thousands and thousands of armed troops. You can use landmines as a means to essentially create that security against a potential invasion without having to devote the manpower to what are hundreds, if not thousands, of kilometer-long borders, depending on the country we're looking at. And so it is a big step back in terms of the Ottawa Treaty to ban landmines, but the justification from the Baltic states ultimately comes down to how do they best secure their border with the growing concern and possible threat of Russian invasion. And so this seems to be part of the direction that they're taking in terms of ensuring their security and trying to hedge against any possible future conflict from Russia.
The FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force is investigating an attack on Tesla vehicles in Las Vegas. Somebody dressed in all black fired a gun into Tesla vehicles parked at a Las Vegas Tesla collision center before setting 2 of them on fire. The word resist was written on the building. Multiple incidents have been reported across the U.S. as Tesla owner Elon Musk works with the Trump administration. And Tesla has been removed from the Vancouver International Auto Show that's opening today. The show's director, Eric Nichols, says that the U.S. electric automaker's presence at the show would have created a safety concern for workers, attendees, and exhibitors.
The Vancouver International Auto Show has removed Tesla as a participant in this week's event after the automaker was provided multiple opportunities to voluntarily withdraw. The political position on this has absolutely no bearing on the decision. This is purely from a safety point for our guests and our attendees.
It's the latest setback for Tesla in BC after BC Hydro banned the automaker's products from the electric vehicle rebate program. So-called Tesla takedown protests were held over the weekend in Vancouver, Ottawa, and elsewhere. The CEOs of 14 energy sector companies in Canada are calling on the 4 federal political party leaders to declare a Canadian energy crisis. They've written an open letter to the leaders calling on Ottawa to help speed up the development of key projects in the national interest. They're calling for a simplification of regulation and a commitment to firm deadlines for project approvals as U.S. President Donald Trump proposes massive tariffs of Canadian goods, including oil and gas. The CEOs are also calling for an elimination of the federal cap on emissions, along with loan guarantees to help Indigenous co-investment opportunities. British Columbia seafood producers are bracing for China's 25% tariffs on a type of clam. The levy on geoduck clams could devastate the multi-million-dollar export industry built almost exclusively on Chinese markets. The head of BC Seafood Alliance estimates exports of the clam to China are worth around $75 million a year. China's seafood tariffs are retaliation for Canada's 100% tax on Chinese electric vehicles, as well as its levies on steel and aluminum. Stuck in space no more. NASA astronauts Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams returned to Earth on Tuesday after 286 days in space, 278 days longer than anticipated. Their SpaceX capsule parachuted into the Gulf of Mexico in the early evening on Tuesday night, just hours after departing the International Space Station.
As you can see there on your screen, continuing to monitor progress of the Dragon spacecraft. And we're going to stand by for splashdown located in the Gulf of America off the coast of Tallahassee, Florida.
And splashdown. Crew 9 back on Earth.
And SpaceX Freedom, splashdown. Good main release.
Copy, splashdown. We see main chutes cut. Nick, Alex, Butch, Suni, on behalf of SpaceX, welcome home.
It was a homecoming for everyone and everything as the astronauts had some company from a pod of dolphins after they splashed down in the water.
Spacecraft. Now, here on your screen, we can see dolphins, actually, who want to come and play with Dragon. Now, one of the fast boats there in place, working to assist the recovery team member. It's incredible. I just love these views. We really see them even better in daytime, but just seeing the recovery team work in tandem to step through.
Within an hour, the astronauts were out of their capsule, waving and smiling at the cameras while being hustled away in reclining stretchers for routine medical checks.
It looks like we're getting our next crew member here. That is none other than Suni Williams. Big smile, big waves. She, like her other crew members, now will be assisted onto the mobility aid.
And there we have it, some waves, some thumbs up, and some smiles.
And after 9 months in space, the two astronauts will have more to adjust to than just catching up on emails. They'll have to begin readjusting to life with gravity. Down to their DNA, astronauts' bodies can change in weird and sometimes significant ways while high above Earth. They start to elongate, often developing a taller space height. And because human bodies are mostly liquid, redistribution of fluids may also give them chicken legs and a puffy head. Once they're back, that all starts to return to normal. Scientists are still figuring out the long-term health effects of spending a lot of time in space, but decades of data shows that astronauts undergo physical changes after even a brief period. Earlier, we spoke with Dr. Abhishek Raut, medical director at Appletree Medical Group, about some of the challenges astronauts face when up in space and how long it takes for everything to go back to normal.
When astronauts venture into space, their bodies will experience a range of physical changes, mostly due to the environment having microgravity, and also the increased exposure to cosmic factors. So one of the biggest, most significant changes we are going to see is muscle atrophy. So as muscles no longer need to work against gravity, we will see that the muscle fibers themselves will begin to weaken, and that's why astronauts in general have to spend several hours each day on exercise regimens to maintain their strength. Another big change we see is bone density loss. In space, bone loses minerals quite quickly, about 1 to 2% per month. And this is because they're not subjected to that typical gravitational stresses that will stimulate bone maintenance on Earth. And so in this case, what you are seeing is over time, you're going to find that these losses could be compared to even an early stage osteoporosis. And really, it requires a lot of careful planning, and maybe even medication updates and targeted exercise protocols to make sure that doesn't happen. The microgravity also causes a redistribution of body fluids. So without gravity pulling fluids downwards, the astronauts will have a fluid shift more towards the upper body and head. And this can lead to some facial puffiness, pressure in the ears, but more concerning, sometimes we start seeing vision problems as well. And the optic nerve will adapt to these different pressures as best as it can. We also see that the cardiovascular system is affected. The heart is now pumping in a weightless state. So as it gradually adapts to this lower workload, sometimes we see a diminished cardiac capacity, which is something that we do have to manage carefully during spaceflight.
We also asked Dr. Raut about how these changes to the body depend on the length of time they're in space and how long it can take to fully recover once returning to Earth.
Right, so that is a big concern here because when astronauts spend longer periods of time in space, many of these physical changes we observe can become much more pronounced, and then they can edge towards being a little bit more permanent as well. So to talk a little bit about the muscle atrophy and bone density, because in microgravity, the muscles don't receive that same resistance as on Earth, this progressive muscle atrophy over time can be very pronounced. We have studies from the International Space Station, which we see more longer missions anyway, showing that astronauts can sometimes lose up to 20% of their muscle strength and about 2% of their bone mineral density strength per month. To give you an example of how rapid that is, for an average male at age 30, you would lose about 3 to 5% of your muscle mass per decade. So what we see here is we do need very strong targeted regimens like strength training at spaceflight, but also when they come back to make sure that this is not permanent. We also, when we talk about these fluid changes, there are things that we do worry about. There's a specific condition called spaceflight associated neuroocular syndrome, which is when that fluid shifts and kind of pushes towards the eyes more, and then over time can actually cause a vision impairment. And sometimes that can, in fact, be permanent as well. When we look at the cardiovascular adjustments, we do know that the system is a bit more flexible, but it does remodel over time in space. And then when we come back to Earth, sometimes the heart and the cardiovascular system is just not used to that increased capacity. And certainly that takes a long time to adjust as well. So what we do find is sometimes when we return back to Earth, it depends on how long you've been away. But if you've been away for a significant amount of time, sometimes it also takes years to readapt, and some of these conditions may end up being permanent as well.
One question that has been asked amid Miss Williams and Mr. Wilmore's extended stay at the ISS is how space travel impacts men and women differently. So we also touched on this subject with Dr. Rout.
When we look at the effects of microgravity on the human body, what we'll see is there's going to be a lot of similarities because both male and female astronauts will face very similar challenges there. But we do know that there are subtle differences in what we see. For example, with the cardiovascular responses to microgravity, we do see some gender-specific nuances. We do have research that shows that women might be somewhat more prone to this orthostatic intolerance. So a condition where the body struggles to adapt to the blood pressure once you're standing back on Earth as well. Bone density loss is another area where we do see some differences that emerge over time. Now, both sexes will lose bone density at a rate of around 1 to 2% per month in space, but hormonal factors like estrogen can play a very important role and a protective role in bone health under normal situations. So we do find that there's a protective nature there. And then finally, what we are seeing, and this is relatively new as well, is there are subtle differences in the immune system and cellular responses as well. So we are seeing gene expression patterns or cellular signaling that may be a bit different between men and women in the face of prolonged space travel. Now, this is very early on in the stages there, but the initial findings show that there may be differences in recovering when you come back to Earth between men and women, and there may be conditions that are more inflammatory that affect one gender more than the other. We still don't have all the information, but certainly something that we are keeping in mind.
I'm Teresa Skubik, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you can always visit our website at forumdailynews.ca and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on X and TikTok. You can also watch all of our commentary programming on the News Forum YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us on Forum Daily News. We'll see you next time. Good night, Canada.